Hi, good morning and welcome back to my channel. My name is Juliet. I'm just going to alter that a bit because it's a bit zoomed in, isn't it? I'm just going to do a roundup of books that I've been reading over the last couple of months. And I was thinking about how I wanted to quickly visually represent how I feel about books. And I was thinking about how when I get to the end of some novels I feel deflated. So hopefully you'll be seeing up there a GIF, if I can find it, of a deflated balloon and a buoyant balloon. So I thought that would be a quick visual guide to how I felt about a novel at the end. And before I get started on just talking about the novels that I have read, I just want to say that since I have been making videos on booktube and watching booktube videos, the scope of what I read has massively expanded, and that's because I'm exposed to different authors and genres as a result of watching videos. But also I found family and friends are much more likely to recommend books and novels to me now, I guess because they know that I'm making videos. So it's been fantastic since I started booktube. In many ways I fulfilled what I wanted to get from making videos, which was to always have good books to read. Well, I have pages of books I want to read, so in this little notebook here, after I've watched reviews, I write down the books that I potentially want to read next. Some of them I've read and some of them I haven't. Some of them I may never get round to, but since joining booktube I'm never stuck looking for a book to read. And I also said one of my other aims of joining booktube and making videos was so that I slowed down and reflected on what I read. And that's certainly the case. Every single book I read now I think about. I may not always post a review on every book I read, but I certainly reflect on that novel and therefore remember the novels that I'm reading and also form an opinion on them in terms of recommending them or not to other people. So for me, booktube has really fulfilled that criteria, and it's been a great creative hobby to get involved in. So let's get started. So the first book I want to briefly talk about is Happy by Nicola Barker. This is an experimental novel. It won the Goldsmith Prize, which is for experimental fiction, and Nicola Barker is concerned in this novel really with deconstructing what a novel is, i.e. what a story looks like. But within that there's also the idea of our story, our narrative, and how without our story and our narrative we don't have a sense of ourselves. It's been billed as a post-apocalyptic dystopia, which is where everything appears to be perfect. So the young have rejected the old ways, or the ways of the old, and they now live in a world where they voluntarily subject themselves to monitoring, and the monitoring is in the form of a graph. And this means that they're constantly monitored for emotional behaviours and thoughts that might be damaging to other people. So this idea, I guess, of the whole world being a safe space. The novel uses all sorts of odd type and colours. At the beginning it's just the graph pinking, so it's really interesting at the beginning, seeing the graph pinking and the fact that certain words like competition go pink. As the novel progresses it gets more and more bizarre. You end up with pages of all different kind of writing. You end up with pages of repetition. To be honest, it really begins to lose me about halfway through. And I think I was reading Nicola Barker talking about this novel, and she said it goes bonkers halfway through. Well, it certainly does. It kind of no longer is a novel anymore. So ultimately reading this, as you can probably see, has left me feeling a bit deflated, because I started with high hopes on this novel, that it was a kind of brave new world idea, picking up on how social media is used today, and actually it didn't turn out to be the novel I thought it was. But that's not Nicola Barker's fault. That was my expectations of a novel, and she was playing with expectations of a novel. So though I felt a little bit deflated and empty at the end, it certainly was a challenging novel to read. I'll leave that with you as to whether you want to read it or not. Okay, the second novel I want to talk about is Reservoir 13 by John McGregor, which was longlisted for the Man Booker Prize. And just reading the blurb very quickly, this is about a teenage girl who is on holiday in this village in England, and she goes missing. And so the novel opens with her going missing and the search and the police roadblocks. But actually the novel isn't about finding out what happened to the missing teenager. The novel is about it's a study of a village and the everyday life of those inhabitants of the village, but also the animals and nature around the village, and how the missing girl is both central in terms of it affects everybody in the village, but also is not central in the sense that it doesn't change or do anything to the nature or the animals or the wider picture. So if you're looking for a novel that is kind of like a whodunit, what happened to the missing teenager, this isn't the novel for you. It requires really close reading, this novel, because John McGregor has played, again, with, it's experimental I guess, has played with narrative form, and each sentence can stand alone. So you might have a sentence that talks about one of the inhabitants of the village going to the harvest festival, and in the very next sentence you're talking about two badgers mating, and there's no distinction between those two sentences. So it's a novel you have to read carefully, you can't skim it in any way. How I'm feeling about it is, again, a little deflated, if you can see, because I don't know, again, very interesting novel to read, but it didn't really leave me feeling anything at all. I think it was a fascinating way to write, and it really interests me, that way of writing, but as a story, it didn't leave me going, oh, I must tell everybody else about this. So yes, an interesting way of writing, but didn't have the emotional resonance and left me feeling a bit empty and deflated at the end. So the next novel I'm going to talk about is one called Sorry to Disrupt the Peace by Patti Yumi Cottrell, which has been longlisted for the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. This has an amazing character in it called Helen. I'll just give you a brief blurb. Helen's adoptive brother has killed himself. It's set in America. Helen's adoptive family are estranged. Helen has decided that she alone is qualified to launch a serious investigation into her brother's suicide and to be a supportive beam of light for her adoptive parents. It describes Helen as compulsive, unstable, likeable and high energy. And Sorry to Disrupt the Peace is a dark comedy about loss, grief, solitude and ghosts. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that. To me, Sorry to Disrupt This Peace was about identity, and it was about a lack of identity, or identity in crisis, fragmented identity, because Helen and her adoptive brother are not American born. Helen is Korean born. Her brother is not her biological brother, he is but another adopted child. And Helen is an incredibly interesting character. She's quite shocking to read about. It's like, oh no, how could you do that? But I think this novel really does show the damage of not having attention paid to your identity, where you come from, what those roots are. Because Patti and her brother are both damaged. He didn't appear to be so until he committed suicide, whereas she appears to be openly damaged in some way. She comes across as personality disordered, potentially has some understanding or comprehension difficulties. But this novel is also very funny. There's some scenes in there that are extremely funny. It is a dark comedy, so you know, it's a comedy about suicide. So this novel really was, I think you have to read this novel carefully. I think you have to read every sentence, because there's some beautiful prose in there, some really poignant moments. You're not quite sure whether to laugh or to cry as you're reading this. And certainly for me, I finished the novel feeling enriched by it, and feeling, even though because of the subject matter it was quite depressing, feeling buoyed up by it. And apparently this is Patti's first novel, so I can't wait to see what she writes next. Okay, so the next novel I want to talk about was one that was written in the 1890s, and it's called News from Nowhere by William Morris, and it was a recommend for my son. We often end up talking about socialism, the Labour Party, the current state of politics, the current state of the world. My son is really very much interested in the idea of socialism, and he suggested I read this novel by William Morris because it's a sort of utopian vision of a socialist world, but from an 1890s Victorian perspective. As far as novels go, it's not particularly, well, it's not a contemporary novel, so it's very much in the style of The Time Machine, where you basically just got talking heads, people having conversations. And in this novel, the protagonist wakes up one day in the socialist London, and he takes a trip up the Thames. So you get to see how the landscape is different. You get to see that there are very few houses, but the houses that are built are innate. You get to see people happy and smiling and working, and everyone seems to be really calm. There are no prisons, there is no crime. It certainly is a utopian vision of a socialist society. But really interesting to reflect on 30 years ago now. People were concerned with the very same aspects of capitalism that we are concerned with today. And though I would say that Ursula Le Guin, who sadly passed away last week, is a much more contemporary writer about socialism and the structure of society, so I would potentially recommend more of her novels. It was an interesting read. I'm glad that I read William Norris's utopian socialist future. Who knows? It may happen. So, buoyed up by it. Next novel I want to talk about, I actually listened to on Audible, and it was Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. Now, I've said in previous videos, I have really not read hardly any classical literature or any Victorian literature except for the stuff I had to read in A-level English, which I didn't do very well in. And I read some Shakespeare and North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell. I've actually blanked out the rest. Oh, Jamaica Inn, because I actually found them so difficult to read, and it put me off reading classical literature for a long time. And then Audible came along, and I thought, well, maybe it'll be easy to listen. And actually it is. I've listened to Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier, and Adam Bede by George Eliot, and absolutely loved them. So I thought I'd give a Dickens a go, particularly as it was Christmas. And Great Expectations looked like the one that I would like. I don't know what it is, but I could not get into it. And believe me, I tried. I listened to about 20 hours of Great Expectations because I was listening to the unabridged version. I got very close to the end and then just thought, why am I putting myself through this? I was getting into the car and actually not wanting to turn the Audible on, so I stopped. And Dickens doesn't do it for me. I just didn't like the voice. I didn't like the voice of Pip. I just didn't like any of it. It made me angry. I thought he was conceited and arrogant. I didn't care about any of the characters. I mean, I loved Miss Havisham because she's so fantastic as a character. But I didn't care what happened. I didn't really care that it turned out that, a bit of a spoiler here, that his invisible benefactor wasn't Miss Havisham. I didn't care that it was a convict. So yeah, definitely felt deflated reading Great Expectations, and I'm really not planning on reading any more Dickens. So unless someone can convince me that Great Expectations is nothing like other Dickens, then Dickens for me and Dickens are over, I'm afraid. Another one I read recently, I've had this on my shelf for years, I think. We Had It So Good by Linda Grant. I think it was shortlisted for something. Oh no, she was shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize for a different book. But this one really drew me in. I was just sorting out my bookshelves. I'll do a tour of those at some point because I've now put them in a different order. Because of the age I'm at and the life stage I'm at, this novel really drew me in because basically it's about a man called Stephen Newman who was born to immigrants in America, came over to England in the 1960s to study at Oxford, and it really is just a kind of examination of his generation. So the generation, sort of my parents' generation, but slightly younger than my parents. You know, the post-war Britain, the idea that things were only going to get better, that everything was going to improve, civilization was going to keep moving forward, there would be no wars. It was a very, very unusual time, I guess, in history, sort of from 1950 up until, I guess, the first Gulf War in the early 1990s, an unprecedented time of peace, in terms of living in the Western world. And so really it's just a study of his life and his friends' lives and the ideals and ambitions that they had, and then what actually happened. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a very traditional written novel, very easy to read in terms of narrative. But the reason I feel deflated at the end of it is not because of the writing. It was, you know, it's an enjoyable novel. I just feel a bit depressed by it. And maybe it's more a reflection of the fact that maybe I'm going through a bit of a midlife slump. You know, I'm 47. I, like many of my peers, are wondering, you know, what's the purpose of life? What have I been doing for the last 20 years in terms of work? And I've just actually changed careers because I want to get more meaning and purpose out of what I do. I've got grown-up children now. Yeah, I found this a bit depressing. It deflated me that we got to the end of the novel and it was just like, well, what was all that about? What was the point of that? I don't know, maybe we have too high expectations of what life's supposed to be about. Or maybe it's just this constant grind of seeing things, so many things going wrong in the world that has led to this sense that life is hard and things aren't going the way that we thought they would after the war. We seem to be entering a period in history again where we are becoming more isolated, where kindness seems to be disappearing. I don't know. Anyway, if you are like me in your 40s or 50s, I think you might find this novel interesting. It might make you reflect on your own life, but it might not make you feel great afterwards at the end. So it's up to you if you want to read it. But yes, a very well written novel. Okay, so another novel I have also read recently is The Book of Strange New Things by Michel Faber. And this is a science fiction dystopian based novel, I guess. It's about a man called Peter who is a pastor and he's married to Bea, and he takes on a job with the mysterious and huge corporation called USIC, which takes him, or USIC, I don't know how you say it, USIC, which takes him galaxies away from his wife Bea in order to preach to a native population on a planet that we are using. It's not clear what we're using it for, whether it's to mine for resources or whether it's to create a new Earth, not sure. But at the beginning of the novel, Peter and Bea are very, very close together. As it presents them as a couple that are really close together, really in tune with each other, and they are, you know, arrogant in their beliefs that him jumping across galaxies and literally being light years away from Bea will make no difference. And as the novel progresses and as Peter gets to know the native inhabitants of the planet, who are extremely different, as in physically look very different from us, him and Bea begin to become very distant from each other. So this is a novel, I guess, about a meditation on relationships, on what keeps relationships intimate. What do we need in order for relationships to be intimate? It's also a meditation on difference. What makes humanity? Are the native populations who look so different from us, are they not non-human? Or are they still human? Is there still humanity there? And it also kind of looks at what religion brings us, you know, in terms of religion potentially brings us hope in difficult situations, potentially brings us miracles or ways out of situations. I really enjoyed this novel. It's definitely, at the end, left me feeling really satisfied. I felt like it, you know, it took me on a journey and it left me feeling differently at the end. I loved the character of Peter. I loved that he was so flawed, and yet you still warmed to him. And well, I do love sci-fi. I do love what ifs. I read before Christmas that I've done a long review on, so I'm just going to briefly mention it here, is As a God Might Be by Neil Griffiths. Absolutely blown away by this novel, which again is kind of a reflection on now religion, how we view someone who has religious visitations in the world today, what it means to be forgiving, to be all loving, what are we all looking for, what do we need in order to feel purposeful. But I'll put a link down to that novel down below, but I highly recommend, if you like philosophical type or existential type novels, then give that one a go. So that's it from me for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope I've given you some ideas of potential books to read. I shall see you all again soon. Bye bye.